Welcome to How Does Your Garden Grow at the Potting Bar at Western Nurseries in Hopkinton. Shea Maloney will show us that orchids are easy. So let's get started with her Moth Orchid 101 workshop.
Hello everyone, I'm Shea. Today we're going to be talking about orchids, and everyone's going to go home with an orchid that then they know exactly how to take care of. You guys are all going to be experts. It's very exciting. So, who here has taken care of orchids before? To mixed success, I'm assuming not perfect success, and that's why we're here today. So today we're going to be talking about Phalaenopsis orchids, also called moth orchids. This is the easiest genus of orchids to take care of. There are 70 species, all native to the tropics. You'll see them in Australia, Indonesia, India, New Guinea, the Philippines. They like warmth, they don't like our New England winters, and they often grow as epiphytes, meaning they grow on other plants. They don't grow in the soil. They need a host plant to grow on up in the canopy. When you understand the climate that an orchid is used to, it makes it much easier to create that climate in your own home. Like I said, the Phalaenopsis are the easiest to take care of all the orchids. Orchids are, in fact, I think the most diverse grouping of plants in the world. There's so much diversity. You'll see orchids of every different color, every different flower shape, specialized orchids that they need one particular insect in order to be pollinated. Really cool, unique stuff. Phalaenopsis is a really big genus of orchids, but they all are very adaptable to our homes compared to many of the other more unique varieties. So, as I said, Phalaenopsis orchids are epiphytes. They live on other plants in the canopy. That's why they have these highly adapted, highly specialized root systems that are a fundamentally different organ than the roots of many other houseplants. For most other houseplants that grow in soil, the roots are fibrous. They're small, ultimately they're even microscopic, the parts that are in the soil absorbing nutrients, absorbing water. Orchids, they are not fibrous, they are thick. They are covered with a thin layer of tissue on the outside called velamen that needs to absorb water, and it takes a little bit of time. It's not like a fibrous root that you water the soil is wet, the root starts absorbing water immediately. This needs to really have some time to absorb water. These growing up in the canopy are used to a rainstorm for 2 hours, constant moisture raining down upon this plant, and then it dries, and the whole plant is able to dry so it doesn't rot in that water. So typically what I've found is watering is the #1 issue that people experience with orchids. Watering is the key to success. So I'm going to explain to you guys the best ways to water. When you bring these home, before we talk about watering actually, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Before you bring these, or when you bring these home, the first consideration that you're going to have is the location in your home where it's going to go. Knowing that it grows in other plants, in a canopy, it suggests that it's not looking for tons of direct sunlight. That's often an issue that people experience with orchids. They think, hey, this is a tropical plant. It wants 8 hours of sunlight every day. No, not these orchids. They grow underneath so many layers of leaves that it wants almost entirely indirect light. They'll take some morning sun. So if you have an east-facing window, it'll tolerate that. It will not tolerate direct afternoon sun blazing into a western window or a southern window. I found my orchids will do really well in a north window. That's bright light all day, no direct sunlight. It's ambient blue light. That will prevent the leaves from getting sunburned. If I put this outside in July, it would take probably about an hour before the leaves would get a sunburn, the flowers would scorch and fall off the plant, and the whole thing would be so stressed. In your home, you want to give it bright, indirect light. Once you have your location down, that's when it's time to start considering watering. As I said, being epiphytes, these plants need some time to soak in water. These thick, succulent roots don't have time to absorb water from the fast-draining medium, the potting medium that it's in. So this is in a mixture of fir bark and horticultural charcoal. Because this is an epiphyte that grows on other plants, we are trying to mimic the potting medium that these plants are used to. It's not going to grow in a cactus soil or a potting mix that's peat moss and compost and organic matter. It wants something much more free draining because it never wants to sit in that much moisture. So, looking at that soil, that it becomes clear that we need to allow the plant to sit in water for about 10 to 15 minutes to water it. You want to water it when the roots are dry. And I see you guys taking notes. Do you want paper and pen? Okay. So, as I said, velamen is that tissue covering the surface of the leaves. It's the best indicator of when your plant needs to be watered. You see these roots are silvery gray. That means they're dry. There's no moisture in there. You pull it out, you look at the plastic liner, all the roots are gray. This is an example of a plant that needs water. There's no moisture, there's no humidity in this pot, there's no condensation along the sides, and all these roots are silvery gray. This is a dry plant. This is an example of an orchid, a Phalaenopsis, that is perfectly well watered. Do you guys see the difference in the colors of the roots? This, I found, is the easiest way to get into the orchid game, is knowing when you need to water, starting with an orchid that grows in a clear plastic liner so you can examine the roots. So let's say this guy is at my house. Let's say he's in a nice eastern facing window. He gets a little bit of morning sun. He gets bright light throughout the entire day. It's been, let's say, 7 to 10 days since I watered him last. He's looking bone dry. It's time for me to water him again. I'm not going to take my watering can, water it, let it drain, put it back. It needs more time to absorb that moisture. So I'm going to bring this whole thing to my sink. I'm going to turn the water on till the water is room temperature. Never use ice cold water, that can damage the roots. These are plants that are native to the tropics, so they have never experienced freezing cold water in their whole life. It could damage the root tissue and then ultimately lead to a root rot. So I always make sure the water, it doesn't need to be quite room temperature, but it should never be brisk. I fill the whole pot up with water. I let it sit for 10 minutes. I might even hose the foliage down. I don't hose the flowers down. If flowers get wet and then they're exposed to too much sunlight, they might get sunburn. I don't know if you guys can see, but we watered these orchids on a bright sunny day in the morning, and then the flowers, the water magnified the water, the sun magnified the water on the flowers, and the leaves got burned. So the flowers never really want to be wet, but the foliage absolutely wants to be moistened. These thick succulent leaves can collect dust quite easily. If you, when you water it, really give the whole plant a shower, it's going to appreciate that. You let it sit 5-10 minutes. You pull it out of the pot. It'll be nice and watered. The roots are going to look like this. Then you let it drain, clear all the water out of this plastic pot, put it back in its catch pot, and put it back where it's going to go. Typically, orchids in these pots, the ones that you guys are all going to be going home with, need to be watered about every 7 to 10 days. But the amount of watering is going to be different for every orchid in whatever, it depends on what medium it's growing in, it depends on what size pot it's in, it depends on the type of pot that it's growing in, plastic, terracotta, clear glass. It depends on the climate of your home, the temperature, the humidity. It depends on the location of the plant in your home. A southern window with a gauzy curtain, northern window, eastern facing window with a baseboard heater. There are a million different factors that are going to determine how often your orchid needs to be watered. So I never tell people to water on a schedule. You're going to have to look at your plant. I check it once a week. I have an orchid that I pulled from the trash here because typically once they stop flowering, no one wants to buy them anymore. So I like to take them home and get them to rebloom. Pulled it from the trash. I water it probably once every 2 to 3 weeks. That's all it needs. Watering also depends on at what stage of growth your plant is at. So right now we all have flowering orchids. So you are going to be bringing home a flowering orchid. It's losing moisture through its leaves. It's losing moisture through its flowers. I find that orchids need to be watered more often when they're flowering than when they're sitting dormant. After about 3 to 4 months, this orchid's blooms are going to start to fall off. So an orchid will bloom, each flower will stay on the plant for about 3 to 4 months. If you get a really long stalk with many buds, you'll get those flowers to last for a long time. We have a person here who's had an orchid blooming continuously for about 2 to 3 years. So that's definitely not what everyone can expect. I've never gotten that to happen. I typically get my orchids to bloom once a year. They start pushing spikes in the fall in about October, November. Those stalks really become quite mature during the winter. They open in early spring. It lasts through the spring and much of the summer. Then it goes quiet for a little bit, and then again in the fall I start to see it grow. I find I have to water my orchid the most when it's flowering and when it's growing. When it's just sitting dormant doing its thing, I might get away with watering it even less, even potentially once a month. When that plant's just sitting there, it's not doing anything, it's not using any water to create new vascular tissue. It's kind of just chilling. The only water it's losing is through respiration of the leaves, which it's not even doing that much because it's not growing. So the key with the watering of the orchids is pay attention to your plant. Be aware of where it is, look at it all the time, look at the roots. You'll get a sense very quickly of how often you need to be watering it. Do we have any questions about the watering? No. Okay. So the next consideration after you've placed in your home, it likes the spot, you're watering it according to its needs, the next thing you're going to be thinking about is fertilizer. Orchids are light feeders for the most part, especially Phalaenopsis. They are able to conserve a good amount of nutrients in these succulent roots, and I find a huge problem that people have is they love their orchids a little too much. They tend to overwater, they tend to over-fertilize. If you put too much fertilizer in this plant, it is going to burn the roots, it's going to cause it to drop its buds, it's going to cause it to grow deformed patterns, and it's not going to flower for you. A plant only needs so much fertilizer to collect through its roots before it's ready to flower. If it's collected that, but it's not ready to flower for any number of reasons, it's being underwatered, it doesn't like the location it's in, it maybe isn't the right time of year, and you keep pushing fertilizer, it's not going to promote it to bloom faster, it's just going to stress the plant out. Typically, you want to be fertilizing. What I do is I only fertilize when the plant is growing. So that's after it flowers. Sometimes it goes through a period of dormancy, and then you'll start to see new stalks either come out this stalk or from the base of the plant. Sometimes you'll see new leaves emerge from the crown. I fertilize probably once every 2 weeks with an orchid fertilizer during that period. It's often late summer, early fall. Other experts recommend that you fertilize through the spring and summer using an orchid fertilizer, either weekly as they say, so a week concentration, very diluted once a week, or a little bit stronger every other week in the spring and summer, often into the fall because that's when you see it growing. Once it really sets its buds, that's when I slow down on the fertilizer. Once it's opened its buds, I stop the fertilizer. This plant is, all its efforts are being focused and growing these beautiful flowers, opening these beautiful flowers. It's ultimately looking for insects to pollinate it. I'm not giving it any food. I don't think it's going to be absorbing food at that time, and it's also potentially going to cause the buds to drop. If you fluctuate, when an orchid's in flower, if you fluctuate drastically, the temperature, the humidity, the moisture, the amount that you're watering, the amount of fertilizer you're using, you can find that unopened buds might drop, open flowers might wilt. When orchid flowers wilt, they never come back. So it's not like one of our really generous houseplants like the Fittonia nerve plant, which will get dry, it'll wilt, look like it's completely dead. You water it and 20 minutes later it perks back up. Orchid flowers, when they're done, they're done. So in this plant, for example, this guy got underwatered because it's very challenging to grow a house orchid in a pot that has no drainage hole. And you see, we do it here ourselves, so it happens, but it's challenging. We're experts at this and we still couldn't master this one. So this stalk, all these flowers are dry, it's not coming back. That doesn't mean that it's time to cut the orchid stalk. A huge question we get about the Phalaenopsis orchids is, when can I cut that stalk? All the flowers are dead, it's just sitting there green, what can I do? Phalaenopsis orchids are the only orchids that will rebloom from the same stock if given the right requirements. So what you'll often see, this guy's done, this is going to start to brown. Once it browns to here, it could continue all the way, or this is a node. Do you guys see this little almost miniature leaf exist right there? I'll show you guys. That is a node. That is an area of undifferentiated cells that for that plant could become a new stalk, it could become a bud. If given the right circumstances, it could potentially become a root. So this is an area where you might get a new stalk to bloom. I've had orchids, they're underwatered, all these flowers die, I water it, and then I get new blooms to come out the end. With the Phalaenopsis, wait till it goes brown before you cut it, every single time. Even if it's browning right here, I still wait and see if it makes it past this point. Because if this guy browns and then a new stalk shoots out of here, it can take only about 8 to 10 weeks to get a secondary bloom. So if you're lucky, let's say September, October, November, it's growing, grows a new leaf, grows beautiful stalks for you. Then end of the spring and midsummer, those flowers start to die. If you are treating your plant right, you would fertilize it, you're watering it when it wants to be watered, it's given a nice bright environment, it's really humid, it's loving it, you could get another flower stalk to bloom at the end of that summer. So you can get more flowers out of these plants. Okay. The fertilizer that I use is just an orchid food. It's all purpose. It's a 2020-2015. Do you guys know what those numbers indicate on your houseplant fertilizers? Typically, it's a little ratio of 3 numbers. It's the amount of it's the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that exists in this fertilizer. So this is 20% nitrogen, 20% phosphorus, 15% potassium. Nitrogen is what promotes the green leafy growth. Phosphorus is what promotes the flowers. That's why there's a little bit more of those nutrients in here. So I would always recommend using a fertilizer. The way you're going to dilute it is you're going to use, all fertilizers are going to have a little enclosed scoop. It's typically about 1/4 teaspoon to 1/2 teaspoon. You're going to mix this in with either 1/2 gallon or 1 gallon of water, depending on how often you fertilize. It's not an exact science. Everyone fertilizes differently, but you want to err on the side of under-fertilizing. If you've been fertilizing a lot and you're like, I'm not sure if I should do this, hold off. If you fertilized 2 weeks ago and you want to give it another boost, make sure it's nice and diluted. Pay attention to the directions. Some people think, it says 1/4 teaspoon per gallon of water. I'm going to do a whole teaspoon. I'm going to give the plant more food. It's going to be fine. Biggest mistake you can make, you can burn the roots, you can cause bud drop, you can cause a million different issues, preventing your plant from flowering. Okay, so another consideration that people often wonder about with their phals is repotting. We on Fridays this past month, we're doing a repotting Friday where everyone would be welcome to come in on a Friday and we'd repot your houseplants. Every single day we were getting orchids, and every single day we were turning orchids away because they didn't need to be repotted. On average, if you are taking care of this plant, fertilizing it, it's growing, it's flowering, it's doing its thing, you'd want to repot every 2 years. That doesn't mean that this necessarily needs to go into a bigger pot. It means that it probably wants a refresh of the soil. This fir bark and this charcoal is going to break down over time and become more soil-like. You ultimately don't want that. That retains a little bit too much moisture. It's not mimicking the environment that this orchid is used to. So that's when we take it out of the pot, clean the pot, refresh the soil, put new soil in there. That's often a time that I fertilize the plant in a secondary tub of water with fertilizer in it, repot it into a new pot. Phalaenopsis orchids are monopoidal orchids, meaning they grow from a single stalk. That means new leaves emerge from the top. That's the only place a new leaf is going to emerge from. It's not a plant that produces runners or rhizomes or secondary pups out of the side. It's only ever going to grow onto the top. Typically, these orchids don't like to get too big either. You never see one of these in the wild that's huge. They like to keep around 6 to 10 leaves at a given time. I always find as new leaves emerge out of the top of this root crown, old leaves die at the bottom. That is typically, when I start to see a lot of that, that's when it's a good time to repot. You can pull the whole orchid out of its pot. You can cut all those old leaves and those old roots off, because typically dying leaves also comes along with dying roots. Cut them off, and you're basically cutting the whole bottom of the plant off and replanting it a little bit deeper than it was before. Sometimes you can repot into a slightly larger pot, but I've never seen a Phalaenopsis orchid planted in something bigger than a 6-inch pot. It doesn't need it, and ultimately all that extra soil, the orchid mix is going to retain too much moisture, and the plant's not going to like it. Okay. Oh, you also never want to repot when a flower is in bloom. That would stress the plant out. Some people would come in with their orchids and they'd be like, it looks like the flowers are almost over, I'm ready to repot it. As soon as you tear the plant out of its home, shake the roots up, stress the plant out, all the flowers that are on the plant are going to wilt, all the buds that are on the plant are going to drop. Typically, you want to repot after flowering, after a period of dormancy, when you start to see new vegetative growth come up. This is the period when you're going to be watering it the most. It's the period when you're going to be fertilizing it the most. It makes sense to give it a fresh set of soil at this time as well. For many houseplants, I'm going to go back to the watering unless there's any questions. I'm just going through all of my thoughts on orchids right now, so please let me know if you guys need me to slow down, if you're confused about anything, you need a little more organization.
Do you ever cut so you know how it's like silvery, let's say that one? Do they become green again, all of them, after you water it, or do you cut them off ever?
This is an example of a root that, this area of the root's never coming back. This is still alive. I would leave that. I would cut this guy. Being epiphytes, they have these adventitious roots that are seeking out more areas in the canopy that they can grow. They're looking out more areas of moisture that they can suck from. They're looking to expand their territory a little bit. Those are good. They are, for many, they're an indication of when the plant needs to be watered because they have it potted in a terracotta pot that you can't see the roots. And it's also just the natural habit of the plant to be growing those aerial roots like that. They're also healthy roots, which oftentimes the roots within the pot will stay too wet, they'll start to rot. These are some of the main roots, often when I'm repotting, that need to then go in the soil because they're healthy. I typically don't cut them unless they're brown. Once they're brown, hollow, or stringy, you can cut them back. And that's basically true for any houseplant that you have. Once you have brown foliage, yellow foliage, rotten foliage, cut it. It's never going to come back. Leaves that have removed, that all the chlorophyll have been removed from them and they're yellow now, that chlorophyll is never going to go back into that leaf. You can always cut it. Same thing with your outside plants. If you have a tree that's got dead branches, you can cut it. I was going to speak on distilled water. Many houseplants that are challenging like distilled water. Our tap water can often be hard. It contains high contents of salt, high contents of calcium, things that can, when they sit in the bottom of your pots, of your houseplants, those things can damage the roots. Orchids, because they're in such a free draining mix, actually don't want distilled water. That hard water that many houseplants don't like actually often contains micronutrients, not nitrogen, phosphorus or potassium, but other nutrients that orchids and all houseplants need in very, very small quantities and trace amounts. Most orchid mixes contain horticultural charcoal. That is a carbon-based product that is extremely porous and it absorbs impurities in the soil. You use horticultural charcoal when you're planting a terrarium. You place it at the bottom of the pot, right above the drainage rocks. What that does is it absorbs salts, it absorbs from the fertilizers, from the water, it absorbs calciums, it absorbs other nutrients that aren't going to want to be sitting at the bottom of that pot, that those plants are not going to want to be sitting in. An orchid mix contains horticultural charcoal, so you don't have to worry about those salts building up. In fact, many of the hard waters that we have in our tap water contain the micronutrients that the orchid needs. So While some people say use distilled water, people think it's like fancier to use distilled water. Never use distilled water on a Phalaenopsis. Some people find that they have nutrient issues. If you're really on top of your fertilizing, it shouldn't be an issue. But most people aren't totally on top of the fertilizing. And it's nice when just the water that you're using from your faucet contains trace amounts of the nutrients that this plant needs. Okay. Also, when you're watering, another thing to be aware of. While this plant likes high humidity, it also is really prone to rot. As I've described, when it lives in the canopy and the trees, it's never sitting in tons of water. It's not possible. So if this plant were to sit in tons of water for more than the 10 minutes to even a couple of hours that you're watering it, if let's say you put this in water for a couple of days, the whole plant is going to rot and die. The roots are going to suffocate and they're going to stop being able to take in water, and ultimately the plant looks like it's been underwatered. So when you water, you want to make sure when you pull it out of your catch pot, when you pull it out of the tub that it's been sitting in, make sure it's drained, make sure there's no water sitting in this crown here. As I said, this is the only area where new leaves come out. If water sits in there for a long time, it's going to rot those new leaves. They're not going to come out. The plant's going to be stressed. It's not going to flower for you anymore. You also want to try to water in the mornings more often than at night. When plants sit in water at night, and this is true for outside plants too, you don't want to be watering your grass at 9 o'clock at night. It promotes fungal issues. Fungal spores like darkness and they like moisture for the most part. They hate the sun. So if I were to water this at night and let it sit in stagnant water all night long, that's going to promote those fungal spores from inoculating the plant, taking over, growing in the medium, growing on the plant, killing the plant. I always water my orchids either first thing in the morning or early afternoon at the latest. Once it starts to get dark out, it's too late. Okay, so let's say you bring this home, you put it in the spot that it likes, you water it, you fertilize it, you take all my advice, it's doing so well. 2 years from now, you've got some new leaves at the top, you've got dead leaves at the bottom, it's time to repot. What are you going to repot in? There are a couple different options. There are no right answers, but it's all about paying attention to the type of pot that you're using and knowing that the care that's going to go along with that type of pot. You can do plastic, which is what it's in now. You can do terracotta, or you could do an orchid pot. Orchid pots you'll often see have holes along the side. This promotes airflow into those roots. Sometimes it also allows you to see into the pot roots, into the pot, look at the roots, see when it needs to be watered. It decreases the chances that the plant's going to rot because it's more opportunity for drainage, more opportunity for airflow. The benefit of this is those that I've listed, but it can often also be challenging to tell when the plant needs to be watered. It really involves you sticking your finger into the soil, seeing when the potting medium feels dry, and then watering it at that point. A terracotta pot is often the most recommended pot for a repotting of an orchid. Terracotta, the clay of terracotta wicks moisture out of the soil. It breathes. So if I were to fill this whole thing with water, you would see water absorb through the terracotta. This whole thing would be darker, and this would just be evaporating humidity. It's much harder to overwater a plant that's planted in terracotta than a plant that's potted in plastic. This is true for all houseplants. I tend to keep all my succulents in terracotta, but go along with that, because it wicks moisture, I don't pot my ferns or my calatheas in terracotta because they need to be watered that much more often. It's losing more water this way. It's great for plants that don't want to be rotted. It's more challenging for plants that need constant moisture, that their soil they like to keep evenly moist. Plastic is the third option. It's typically not recommended unless you can do a plastic pot that's clear. The benefit of the clear plastic pot is that you can see the roots, you can know exactly when it's time to be watered. With the plastic pot, you also want to make sure it has a catch pot. If this is exposed to too much brightness, these roots aren't necessarily used to being exposed to that much sun. It's going to dry out faster, the roots could potentially burn. So I always think it looks more decorative anyways to place your plastic pot in a catch pot. If all you have, let's say, is a black plastic nursery pot with a drainage hole, it's what you're going to use, it's all you have, that's fine, but it's going to be up to you to figure out how often you need to be watering that orchid. Probably once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks, potentially even once a month. The plastic is going to retain moisture much longer than the terracotta. You're not able to see when the roots are dry, so it's kind of a guessing game. Some people get moisture meters. They're great for all houseplants. You stick a little probe into the soil to the depth that it indicates. It'll tell you how moist it is in there, and it often even includes a list of plants that need moisture at certain levels. So you stick it in, and let's say you have this type of orchid, it'll say, okay, you're at a 2, you want to water that when it's at a 1, let's say. So moisture meters can be very helpful with the orchids like any other plant.
We hope some of your questions were answered, and now you too think orchids are easy. This is Deb Moore for How Does Your Garden Grow at HCAT TV. Remember to help grow a greener world.